All right. So with that, I guess we can get started with agenda item 1. So I'd like to call the Wednesday, June 23rd, 2021 meeting of the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners, Mule Deer Enhancement Program for Management Areas 1 and 2, Subcommittee meeting to order at 6:01 p.m. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded and it's going to be kept as part of the official record. So the next step for this is going to be to take a roll call of all the subcommittee members. So when I call your name, please just turn your camera on real quick and you can state your name for the record, and then also just tell everyone what organization you're representing as a part of the subcommittee here. So we can start with Arnie.
Here, and I guess I'm representing the Washoe County CAB.
Okay, great. Steve.
Yeah, Steve Robinson here. I'm representing Washoe County CAB.
Larry.
Larry Johnson. I can say, I guess I'm representing Coalition for Nevada's Wildlife.
Okay. Dan.
Yeah, Dan Ryan, representing the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay. And Joe.
Here, and with no affiliation, just private, I guess.
Okay. Representing the sportsman.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark.
Good evening, everybody. This is Mark Freeze. I'm the supervising habitat biologist in Indal's Western region.
Okay. And I'm John Ivonic. I'm the new game biologist for Washoe County for Nevada Department of Wildlife. So with that roll call, we can move to agenda item 2, which is the approval of the agenda. So the subcommittee will review the agenda and they can take action to approve this agenda. And the chairman, in his discretion or upon request, can take items out of order or combine items for the consideration by the subcommittee, and may remove items from the agenda at any time. So because this is an action item, we have to have a public comment break here. So we'll take a 3-minute break, but I'll read the official thing here. So due to the approval of the agenda item being an action item, we'll take public comment prior to taking action. Persons wishing to comment are invited to either raise their virtual hands in the virtual meeting forum, and then each person that's offering public comment during this period is limited to no more than 3 minutes. And people may also provide written public comment via email to ndowgame@ndow.org. So the time is 6:04. So we'll give it 3 minutes here for public comment on the agenda. Okay, so the time is now 6:07. Cooper, have you been monitoring the public comment email?
Yeah, we are seeing no public comment in the email and no virtual hands have been raised.
Okay. So with that, we'll need a motion to approve the agenda from the subcommittee.
Subcommittee member Pitts, motions to approve the agenda for the June 23rd meeting.
Subcommittee Dan Ryan will second that.
Okay, great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, great. So the agenda's been approved and we can move on to agenda item number 3. And for that, it's going to be kind of an informational talk on the Mule Deer Enhancement Program for Washoe County. And can everyone see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Cool. Perfect. All right. So before we get started, I kind of want to provide like a roadmap of the presentation topics that I'm going to be covering. And then that way you'll know what to expect throughout the presentation. But first, I'm basically just going to give you kind of like a brief overview of the Mule Deer Enhancement Project and kind of just introduce you to our local Washoe County Mule Deer team. And then after that, I'll dive right into talking about the population trends for these deer here in the northern Washoe hunt units. And then, after that, I'll talk about some of the potential threats that are facing those deer and in the herds that we have here in Washoe. And then right after that, our habitat biologist, Mark Fries, is going to jump in and tell you a little bit about some of our current and some of our historic projects that NDOW is doing to kind of improve the habitat for mule deer. And then following that, I can address any questions that come up from the subcommittee, but we'll kind of just have a general discussion as a subcommittee about what we think is going on with the mule deer herds here in Washoe. And then after that, we'll have time for public comment where we'll take comments. And so as a member of the public, if you're tuning into this, you can see the email address at the bottom of this slide, but submit your questions that you have to ndowgame@ndow.org. And, once again, we'll address those in the public comment section. All right, so before diving into the concept of the Mule Deer Enhancement Project, I thought it would be pretty important to introduce all the members and kind of just how the structure of all this is going to be set up. So the Mule Deer Enhancement Project is set up by having groups of local mule deer teams, and I believe there are 14 of those throughout the state. And each of those mule deer teams is kind of comprised of a diverse group of stakeholders. And all of those stakeholders have a pretty vested interest in improving these mule deer populations that are specific to their local region. And the mule deer teams are made up of county advisory board members, sportsmen, ranchers, members of the industry, nonprofits and local biologists here at NDOW. And so there's also this statewide Mule Deer Enhancement Oversight Committee, which kind of oversees all 14 of those individual mule deer teams. And you can see the names of the members on the Oversight Committee here. And those are the ones listed on the right. And I'll kind of tell you a little bit more about the structure of this whole thing. So prior to tonight's meeting, that oversight committee was established, and their basic goal was to to provide the commission and NDOW with input on their mule deer management. And then across the state, there are these 14 mule deer teams that are created. And, our Washoe team just introduced themselves here. And we're going to kind of discuss some of the issues that are being faced or that these Washoe mule deer are being faced with. And that's kind of the purpose of this presentation section, where NDOW biologists are going to summarize kind of the historic as well as the current information about, these local mule deer herds. And then at the end of this meeting, like I said, we're going to kind of have a discussion about, what we all think is going on with these herds. And then how we want to move forward. And then after all of that, we're going to take a trip out into the field and go out on a field trip to look at some of the conditions of the range out there and discuss some of those potential habitat improvement projects. And then after the field trip, we're each going to fill out a limiting factor and a mule deer needs assessment form. And so the picture on the left here is what one of these could look like. So they haven't necessarily been approved by the Oversight Committee yet, but once they're approved, I'll get those, distributed to each of the subcommittee members here. And basically how that works is this limiting factor sheet. You go through each of those hunt units and you're pretty much assessing for each hunt unit, things that you think may be limiting that deer population. So, maybe you think that shed hunting isn't that important for one hunt unit, you would label that a 0 for being of least concern. And then if you think something else like juniper encroachment is of the most concern for that area, then you'd mark it with a 5. And once we've kind of identified those limiting factors for that, for each of those hunt units, then you'll go through and fill out the mule deer needs assessment sheet. And basically what that does is you're looking at all of those limiting factors and you're kind of ranking how we can go through and kind of fix some of those limiting factors. And so after we fill those out, the subcommittee will submit 1 to 3 proposals to the Oversight Committee. And, that'll be for saying that, we want to do these projects within these hunt units. And for that, I think we have until about next January before any decisions are made in terms of what's going to be funded or what's not going to be funded. So, we got a lot of time here to go out and really, really assess what's going on with each of these herds and try and get, the most bang for our buck here. And then, after that, they'll eventually make a decision in terms of which projects are going to be funded. So with that, we can kind of jump right in here and take a look at what's going on statewide with Nevada's mule deer herd. So the figure that you see here shows the population estimates for all of our game species in Nevada. And it's important to note that the mule deer are indicated by the white line there. And it's also important to note that they have a different axis. So if for looking at the mule deer population, you want to look at the vertical axis on the right. And what you'll notice is that back in the early 80s, there was, a real boom in the population, and it skyrocketed up there to just shy of 250,000 deer before declining and eventually sort of stabilizing out in around the mid 1990s or so. So for about the past 25 years, the population across the state has been fairly stable with a slight decline or so across the past 25 years. And then when we're looking at these population metrics, there's really 2 things that we're looking at here that are pretty important. And so that's the number of fawns that you have for 100 does, as well as the number of bucks that you have for 100 does. So that fawn to doe ratio, it is coming from an early spring survey. So we're not necessarily looking at how many fawns are hitting the ground or how many fawns each doe is given birth to, but rather we're looking at how many of those fawns have survived the winter and are actually being recruited into the population and are actually, going to be a pretty big driver of those population estimates. And then for our buck to doe ratio, we're looking at that in the fall post hunt. So we're looking to see how many of those bucks survived the hunt season and are available to be breeding those does. And so, before I dive in here to the Washoe County stuff, I wanted to kind of give you some big picture, kind of broader perspective of what these numbers look like statewide, just so you kind of, you had some baseline of what it's looked like historically throughout Nevada. So what you'll see is each of these dots represents the estimate for the population, and then the line in there, the dotted line is your trend line. So for those fawn to doe ratios, you can see that back in like the late 70s, they were pretty high, and that likely is what contributed to that boom in the population in the 80s. And since then, there's kind of been, some ups and some downs, but the average for those is hovering right around, between 30 to 40 fawns per 100 does that are being recruited into the population in the spring. And then for our statewide buck to doe ratios, you can see that we averaged in the mid to low 20s from about 1980 through 2000 or so. And since 2000, we've seen a fairly steady incline in those ratios, and they've kind of hovered, just over 30 bucks per 100 does. And so this is, kind of just some background in terms of statewide. This is what the numbers are looking like. So to better understand what's going on with our local mule deer here, we can kind of look at some more fine scale data and kind of take a look at some of those population trends within each of these hunt units. And so here you can see there's a map for the hunt units that we have in Washoe County. And this doesn't include hunt unit 194 or 196 because Carl Lackey has already covered that in his mule deer enhancement presentation. So I'm pretty much just going to be focusing on everything that's north of Reno and north of I-80 there. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the hunt units, this map can kind of lay that out for you, but we're basically going to start in the southern portion, which is management area 2, and that's hunt unit 021 and 022. We're going to gradually work our way north up into management area 1 and finally end up at the Oregon border with 011 and 033. Okay, and so it's also important to note that for all of those hunt units that I just rattled off there, they're not all managed the same. So NDOW has 3 different management types for mule deer. First, you have standard hunts where we're managing for about 30 bucks to 100 does. And within Washoe County, units 011 to 013, 022, and 033 are considered standard hunts. For your non-standard hunts, we're managing for about 35 to 45% hunt success. And we're looking at units 015 and 021. And then for these alternative hunts, it's kind of a combination of those two where we're managing for 35 bucks to 100 does, 40 to 55% hunt success. And then we're looking to have about 50 to 75% of 4 points or better in the harvest. And the only unit that we have in Washoe that's an alternative hunt is 014. So with that, we can kind of dive into some of these populations a little bit closer. So starting here with 022, which is located in that southeastern corner of Washoe County. We can take a look at the figure in the top left, which is your population estimate. And, once again, the estimate is the dot, and then your trend line is going to be the line going through that. And, for this hunt unit, although it's been slightly below average for the past 3 years here, the 20-year trend for this population is on a slightly positive trajectory. And the figure in the top right is your fawn to 100 doe ratio. And you can see that that's been on a pretty positive trend as well. So it would make sense that with recruiting more fawns into that population, that it's going to experience a positive population trend. And if we look at the figure in the lower left, you can see that this is our post-hunt buck to doe ratio. And for that, you can see that it's got a positive trend over the past 20 years as well. Just looking at the 20-year trend. And then if we look at the amount of 4 points or better in the harvest, which is the figure in the lower right, you can see that it's held pretty steady. You know, it's kind of flatlined. It's had its ups and its downs, but it's kind of averaged about 50% of the harvest has been 4 points or better in the harvest. And what you're probably noticing for these graphs is if they have a positive trend line, they're colored in blue. If the trend line for the population is stable, they're going to be yellow in color. And if the trend line is in decline, then they're going to be depicted in orange dots and in lines. So if we move to management unit 021, once again, looking at that population estimate in the top left corner, you can see that 20-year population trend is on a positive trend. And, you know, once again, that's reflected really nicely in those fawn to 100 doe ratios. You know, it's been on a pretty high trajectory there for the past 20 to 40 years. And, you know, then if we look in the lower left-hand corner, if we can look at the post-hunt buck to 100 doe ratio, you can see that it's been on a positive trend over the past 20 years. And if you look just in like the last 10 years alone, it's had some really strong numbers in terms of the buck doe ratio. And then once again, looking at the percentage of 4 points or better in the harvest here, you can see that it's remained, you know, pretty stable here for the past 40 years or so. And if you look at the last 10 years, though, if you look at the last 10 years specifically, we can see that it's been, you know, slightly below the average for them. So to kind of summarize what's going on with these two southern units for management area 2, you can see that over the past 20 years, their numbers are looking relatively well compared to some of the other units within Washoe County. And, you know, I hope you didn't get too used to looking at all the blue in these figures, because the further north that we go, the more orange you're going to see in these graphs, and it's going to start to look a little bit more bleak. So to start off, for management area 1, we have the population estimate in the upper left for 015. And you can see that it's been on a pretty steady decline across the past 20 years. However, that, you know, in the past 10 years or so, that population has kind of begun to stabilize, and it's kind of starting to flatten that curve, but it's definitely at a lower density than it was previously. And looking at our April fawn to doe ratio here, you can see that, you know, it's on a pretty stable trend, and it's above maintenance levels, even with those past 3 years being a little bit below average. And then that fall to buck doe ratio in the lower left corner seems to be just on a pretty steady incline. And on the right, if you look at the amount of 4 points or better in the harvest, it appears to be holding pretty steady with a little bit of an incline, and it's averaging right there about 35% or so. So 014, which seems to be everyone's favorite problem child. This is the Granite Range. So looking at this population estimate in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that from 2004 till about 2014, the population was on a pretty steady increase. And then, you know, since 2014, it's kind of been on the decline pretty steadily. And if we look at the figure on the top right, that's your fawn to doe ratio. you can see that that average is pretty stable, but it, it's got a little bit of an incline here over the past few years. And those fawn numbers have been, once again, consistently at or above maintenance levels. So they should still be maintaining that population. And then in the lower left, we can look at, your number of bucks in the herd, which if we look at that 40-year trend, it's been on a pretty steady increase. But, it's been a little bit below average for the past 10 years, but, on a whole, the long-term trend is kind of positive. And then same thing here for the 4 point or better in the harvest, where you can see that it's been on a decline for the 40-year trend, and then also our past 8 years or so have kind of been a little bit below average for that. So, moving all the way to the north end of Washoe here, historically, what we used to do is we would estimate the population for 033, which is the Sheldon, separately. However, as biologists were flying in the helicopter, they were kind of struggling to find a sufficient sample size of deer on their surveys. And so, that kind of resulted in the models not running with such a small sample size of deer. So back in 2016, the surveys for 011 and 013, or I'm sorry, 011 through 013 were combined with 033, and that modeling now will run because we have a sufficient sample size of deer. And you can see if you look at that figure for 033, I put the dots in there as a different color just so you can see that that's where the modeling was combined for those units. And what you'll notice here is that the population trend for 011 to 013 is it's kind of been in a slight decline, but is a little bit more stable than 033. And you can see that the past 5 years or so have been below average, but they're showing some slight signs of increase. And then for 033, you can see that it's been on a steady decline, but once again, in the past 5 years or so here, it's kind of starting to flatten out here and isn't in such a drastic decline as it was previously. So for all of these northern units here, if we take a look at the 20-year trend for our fawn to doe ratios, you can see that it's on the decline, but the last 5 years have kind of shown a little bit of potential being above average here. And, similarly, the buck to doe ratios have been on a slight decline, looking at that long-term trend. But, there's been a handful of years that were, above average here across the past 10 years, both for the percentage of 4 points in the harvest as well as the buck doe ratios. And, although the long-term trend for a lot of these units has kind of been, trending downward, it seems like there's been a little bit of potential or they're kind of starting to rebound a little bit here in these past few years. And I'll kind of discuss some of the reasons that may be leading to that a little bit later in the presentation here. And so now that we've looked at the population metrics for each of these hunt units in Washoe, we can start to kind of look at some of the habitat factors and some stuff that may be influencing some of these numbers and some of these deer populations. Okay, so in environmental planning, there's this term, it's called a wicked problem. And I believe it pretty adequately describes all of the potential issues that the mule deer of Washoe have, that they're kind of encountering here. And you can kind of see just a whole list of examples there on the right-hand part of the screen, but I won't, read through them, but we'll kind of go into some of those a little bit later here in depth. But most of those wicked problems can kind of be lumped into one category, which is your habitat conditions. So in order to understand, why these mule deer are so closely tied to the conditions of the range, we need to better understand the way that the mule deer are eating and kind of just the way that they function. So mule deer are browsers, and they rely really heavily on, not so much the quantity of forage, but they rely on the quality of it. So they need really high quality forage. So what that means is both changes in, the availability as well as the quality of your browse is going to directly impact your mule deer herd. And you can have fires come in and burn up some of that browse, or you can have landscapes that are kind of converted to, just seas of cheatgrass. And that the quality of the nutrition in some of the plants as they begin to kind of age and become older and more senescent, that the quality of that nutrition is going to decline as well. So the quality of the food that's available to the mule deer on the landscape is really heavily tied to just the amount of precipitation that an area is going to get. So as most of you guys are well aware, Nevada is currently experiencing some pretty extreme drought conditions. And, with that limited amount of rain that we have in the Great Basin, we kind of have a limited amount of potential for productivity on the landscape here. And so David Stoner is a researcher from Utah State, and he published this paper back in 2017, which basically looked at the quality of forage that was available to mule deer within the Great Basin. So if you take a look at this figure here, you can see that the red values have low forage quality, and you can really see that a lot of Western Nevada is pretty darn red. And what this is doing is it's looking at the satellite imagery, and it's extracting values for greenness. And what he found in that paper is that there was a direct correlation between the productivity of forage in the Great Basin and the abundance of deer in the Great Basin. So if you look at that western portion of Nevada, which we saw in the last slide has low values for forage quality, it's not super surprising that it's also got, a pretty low abundance of deer as well. And to kind of continue on the this trend of talking about precipitation here, the bar graph here is showing the amount of precipitation in Nevada, and you can see that the mule deer population, which is the line above it, tracks that number pretty darn well. And the figure on the right shows your level of correlation between your precipitation as well as the population estimate. And to give you an idea, something that is perfectly correlated or exactly the same, it's going to have an R-squared value of about 1. And if you look at the R-squared value here, it is 0.8. So those two are pretty heavily correlated. So for Washoe County specifically, I don't really need to preach to you guys, how dry it's been. You guys have been out here and you're all well aware of that. So what you're looking at here is the summer precipitation across the past 40 years. And no surprise, it's been on a pretty steady decline. And for this figure here, the red bars are representing years that were below average for your precipitation, and the blue ones were years that were above average. So as you can see, there are a lot more red bars than there are blue ones, especially in the past 20 years or so. So from 1980 till about 2000, you have 11 wet years compared to 9 dry years. But then in the last 20 years here, from 2001 to 2020, you have 8 wet compared to the 12 dry years. In those 8 wet years, 2 of them are just barely wet. So you're really kind of looking at 6 wet years compared to 12 dry years. So the past 20 years have been, the average there has been pretty dry in Washoe. To go with all of that lack of precipitations, our temperatures have really kind of been getting warmer on average as well. So you can see how, both the lack of precipitation with the increase in temperatures really sets the stage well for fires. And so since 1900, there's been over 2 million acres that have burned in Washoe County alone. So it's kind of hard to picture what 2 million acres looks like. But to put that into perspective, the whole county is about 4 million acres. So that doesn't necessarily mean that 64% of the county is actually burned, but instead, you have these areas where there's kind of a lot of overlap. So fires are going to burn into an area that's already burned, and then you have that overlap of the fire perimeters, and you have cheatgrass, which is really kind of fueling that issue. And part of the problem that we have with these repeat fires is that it doesn't really allow the sufficient time for your brush communities to regrow, because they regrow at a much slower rate than your annual grasses. And so if you look at, some of these pictures are kind of dialed in here to management area 2. You can see that some of the areas in management area 2 have just kind of burned and then burned again and then burned again, all in those same overlapping spots. And then you have areas up there in northern Washoe County that, haven't burned in quite a long time. So you can really kind of see the two ends of the spectrum. And I guess, like what I'm driving at here is that fire it's incredibly complex, and, not all fires are bad and not all fires are good. But as I kind of mentioned on the previous slide there, some of the areas in Washoe have burned too frequently, and then some of the other ones haven't really burned in quite a while. But what does that all mean for mule deer? So mule deer do really well in early successional stages. And what that means is that they do well after any sort of disturbance or after fires. But if those fires are happening too frequently, what happens is it doesn't allow the proper vegetation to come in and recover. And then it could primarily be turned into, a whole bunch of cheatgrass or other invasive annuals. And, similarly, if you get an area that hasn't burned for decades, some of those older shrubs in there, they can kind of become a little bit more senescent. And, the nutritional quality for them is going to kind of dwindle, and they're not going to be as productive for your mule deer herds. So, when talking about fire and mule deer nutrition, there's really kind of this complex sweet spot where you have, too many fires too frequently, and then you have not enough fires on the landscape. And so a pretty important aspect when it comes to your fire is both how resistant and how resilient your ecosystem is. And so both low values for resistance and resilience are indicated by red. So, if you take a look at Washoe County here, you can see that it's pretty darn susceptible in terms of just, the potential to have fires occur, but then also, it's looking pretty bad in terms of lacking the ability to keep that quality vegetation after a fire comes through. And so, part of the reason for those low resistance and resilience values is in large part our issue that we have with this conversion of vegetation. And primarily what we're talking about here is cheatgrass in Washoe. And so you can see the outline here of Washoe County in black. And the figure on the left is from 84, and the figure on the right is from 2019. They haven't updated it, so I can't get the past 2 years, but it's pretty close to current. And what you can see is there's a pretty drastic increase in your cheatgrass for, a majority of management area 2. And you can also see some pretty heavy increases in those cheatgrass loads up there in 015 and 014, some in 013 and 012 as well. And, you know, why that's problematic is this conversion of cheatgrass is a pretty crazy cycle the way it works. So cheatgrass is incredibly effective at coming right in and establishing, you know, after a fire or any sort of disturbance or anything comes through. And then, you know, once that cheatgrass is established, it's going to choke out a lot of the native forbs and a lot of your native grasses. And, you know, that's not only problematic because it's going to be, you know, choking out some of the amount of feed that you have for the mule deer, but it's also going to act as sort of like like fine fuel to kind of continue to carry that fire and to have fires kind of spark up and fuel spark up more frequently. So so to speak, cheatgrass is really kind of adding fuel to the fire. And, you know, we may see more fires as a result of it because of this vicious cycle where you have more cheatgrass and more fires and more cheatgrass. So sticking with that same theme of having, you know, an interrupted fire cycle, Washoe County has also experienced an increase in conifer cover. And so the big thing to focus on here is if you look at this orange outline for Washoe County, if you look at this northern part, similar to the last figure, the one on the left is from 1984 and the one on the right is from 2019. So you can see that up here in some of these northern units like 011 and 013, you know, there's been a pretty drastic increase in your conifer cover. And that's problematic not only because the way that Western juniper work, they're going to affect the water that's available for the rest of your plant community in there, but they're also providing ambush cover for your predators, which is going to be problematic for your mule deer in the area. So statewide, Nevada doesn't necessarily seem to have any shortage of horses and burros. And the figure on the left here is showing a breakdown of how many horses there are on public land by each of the states. So you can see, unfortunately, Nevada is leading the pack. Here's a picture that I took up in unit 014. And this was the very last week in April, and the spring was already in this condition. So, you know, there were 54 horses piled on this spring. The surrounding vegetation all around it was pretty much stripped of vegetation. And that water source was already starting to look like it might be dry by, you know, the end of June or something. It was in pretty rough shape. So with all the stuff that I kind of covered in the beginning to outline, you know, how important the resources on the landscape are to mule deer, you can kind of see that, you know, in years when you have that lower precipitation, you're not only going to have lower quality of vegetation, but you're also going to, you know, really amplify the competition for both, you know, vegetation and water with the other animals that you have on the landscape, like these horses and burros. And so the picture on the left here is from Little Antelope Springs, and it kind of really outlines just how detrimental horses can be, you know, on a resource. So you can see that that's pounded in pretty well, pretty much stripped of vegetation, and the spring is, you know, all but dry. And so when horse numbers are in excess of carrying capacity or your AML, which is an appropriate management level, it can, you know, really start to damage your resource. And the map on the right here, what that is it shows the outline of Washoe County in red. And then all of the blue polygons there are your herd management areas. And you can see that 021 has 2 HMAs, 022 has 2 HMAs, 015 has 5 HMAs, 014 has 3, and 013 has 2, 012 has 5, and 011 has 3. For unit 033, it used to have horses on it. However, and that's the Sheldon Wildlife Refuge. But however, a few years ago, those horses were removed. And, we may start to see some of those positive impacts on our mule deer herd in that region. And let's see. So with those HMAs that I outlined here, here's kind of just a list of them. And these are all from the previous map. And what I really want to point out here is the AML, which stands for the appropriate management level. So for all these hunt units that we've been discussing, we're at 376% of appropriate management level for the horses and 516% of AML for your burros. And it's also important to point out that these are the 2020 numbers. So we don't have access to the 2021 numbers yet. So, there's a whole nother full crop that's added to this population. And, given how little rain we've had and, how little vegetation there is on the landscape, you can really see how having all these extra animals on the landscape competing for those resources could be potentially problematic. And, lastly here, the horse and burros aren't the only ones that are exhibiting competition out there, for the resource. The springs and forage are just as susceptible to improper cattle grazing and high densities as they are to the horses. So you can see in that picture on the left there, just how impacted that spring is by the cattle, both in terms of the stripped vegetation as well as, it's pretty dry and it's pretty pounded in as well. In the picture on the right, you can see the difference in the understory between the sage. So on the right side there, you don't really have any understory at all. Whereas on the left, you have some annual grasses in between your sage patches. And what I really want to emphasize and stress here is that it's not, not all cattle on the landscape are bad, but we just have to be careful with those stocking densities that we're putting out on the landscape when, you already have an elevated number of horses and burros. So there's really just this tremendous competition on the landscape for all of these resources. And then to kind of continue with that trend of, high densities, humans have also had an impact, on these mule deer herds as well as their habitat. So, Reno's got an ever increasing population. And with that increasing population of people, there's this increasing need to house people. And, as somebody who just, recently moved to Reno and tried to find a house, I can definitely attest that there are more people in Reno than there are houses for them. So, it makes sense that this issue is occurring, but, although that suburban sprawl isn't anywhere near as bad as it is in 194 and 196, it still has some potential to impact the winter range on the mule deer for 021 and 022. So in those years where you get, pretty good snowfall up there at higher elevation, your mule deer are going to kind of go down into those valley floors. And conveniently, those valley floors are where people are kind of starting to build those housing tracts. So you can see that, there's some overlap there in terms of habitat that both humans and mule deer are looking to utilize. And, we're kind of converting some of that winter mule deer range into housing developments. And with those housing developments, you're going to not only have, the tracks for houses, but you're going to have an increase in roads. And more importantly, you're going to have an increase in traffic going through that winter range. So you can see that, there's some potential for that to affect some of those deer in management area too. So now that I kind of painted that doom and gloom picture about, what's going on with the mule deer Washoe, I want to talk about what NDOW is doing about all of those issues and, kind of about all of those potential threats. So I'll start by outlining some of the research projects that NDOW has done, and then I'll turn this over to Mark Fries, who's our habitat biologist, and he can talk about some of the improvements we made. So currently, I'm assuming most of you have bought a hunting license and you've paid some predator fees on that hunting license. And for project 2201, NDOW is currently using some of those predator fees to contract out lion removal. So we're removing lions periodically in units 011 to 013, and that's for the protection of bighorn sheep populations. And they're going to remove lions until the sheep population hits that target objective. And that project's been going on here for about the past 5 years. And then also we had project 18, which began back there in 2004. And throughout the 10-year period that they ran the project, they removed over 1,200 predators from unit 014. And we didn't necessarily see, any significantly more deer in the surrounding units, and that project ended back in 2014. Another research project that we have going on is project 46. And so for this project, NDOW is partnering with Oxford University and Montana State. And we're basically implementing a study to kind of look at the relationship between mule deer, habitat variables, climatic variables, horse populations, and predator populations. And basically what's going to happen is this summer, there's a grid of trail cameras that are going to be laid out across all of Washoe and parts of Pershing County. And then along with that grid of cameras, we're going to have a grid of weather stations. And so with that, we're going to be able to get at, abundance densities for those horse numbers, for the predator population, and also for our mule deer population. So that'll be, particularly of interest to this mule deer enhancement project. And, that's something we may be able to use in the future. Another part of this is the mule deer collar data. And so for Secretarial Order 3362, NDOW put a bunch of collars on mule deer, and they were looking at ways to identify migration corridors and some possible ways to improve those corridors. So this map here is a distribution of the collars that we have across these Washoe hunt units. And you can see that they're pretty concentrated in units 021, 014, 013, and 012 and 011. And each color of those little dots kind of represents, a different collared individual. So instead of like squinting at it, we can go over it by each management area. So for management area 1 here, these collars were particularly eye-opening because it kind of allowed us to see all of that movement that goes on in between the hunt units. And, that's pretty eye-opening. And from this, Cody Schroeder has kind of used this collar data to pick out some movement corridors for these herds. And, those movement corridors are areas that we can potentially target with some of our improvement projects for the MDEP. And also from this collar data, you can kind of generate some crucial winter range and crucial summer range. And from that, once again, we can look at that and kind of try and target some of our MDEP projects in that crucial winter or summer range. So this is a closer look at management area 2. And as you can see from that one brown or tan collar down there in the south, as well as some of those blue and purple points, we have some seasonal movement across the border between Nevada and California. And so that one collared brown the brown points down there, that doe, she took off about May 20th. And she was likely going up there, kind of just beyond Stampede Reservoir to go kind of follow that green up of vegetation and to go have her fawn in California. So, it's important to realize that some of these herds, we're sharing across the border here with California. I'd mentioned that we can use those collar data to kind of delineate seasonal ranges that are crucial habitat to the mule deer herd. So here's a look at some of the past maps that we have, and you can see the crucial winter range and summer range in each of those management areas, with management area 1 on the left and management area 2 on the right. And we can use that collar data that we have to kind of create some more updated maps of crucial winter and summer range. And, I'd also mentioned that, we can kind of visualize how those points play out seasonally. So with this, it's a little kind of animation that I made where, is it going to work? So if you look at, there we go. If you look at the date on the top, it's going to kind of play through these points, and it's giving you a week's worth of points for each of the mule deer. So you can kind of see, where each of the collared deer are going. And just to kind of generalize here, they're spending their winters down lower, and they're spending their summers up at higher elevation where you have some kind of, higher quality vegetation and some better fawning ground. And so with this, it's pretty interesting, once again, looking at this animation, seeing just how much movement there is between these hunt units. Until you hang collars on deer, you never really know just how much intermingling they do, but it's pretty fascinating to watch them. And I know some of you are probably getting excited as we come to the fall time here, but this is all just collar data from does. So, none of these are from bucks here. And that'll keep on going, but I think you guys get the gist of it. So Cody's mule deer collaring project kind of dovetails really nicely into a project that'll be going on this summer, where the Wildlands Network is going to be looking at areas along Highway 395, and they're looking at the current crossings that we have in place. So right now along parts of 395, there's, I believe it's 8-foot tall deer fencing that's kind of keeping deer off the highway and funneling them to these crossings. So they're kind of doing a study to look at the corridors on 395 and see just some of those areas that the deer are using. Then after they've identified those spots, they're going to work with Caltrans as well as the Department of Transportation to try and go in and try and improve some of those migration corridors and allow for better passage back and forth over 395. And I know, some of you are probably sitting here thinking, yeah, but that's in California. But, based off of, the collar data that we have, this area is pretty important for winter range for some of those deer from unit 021. And some of the, that brown, the brown dots there did end up crossing 395. So, some of them will cross this on their seasonal migrations, and other ones will have their winter range kind of butt right up to 395 there. So this is a pretty extensive list, and I know it's small text. I don't really expect you guys to be able to read this by any means, but basically we can sum up all of the habitat projects that we've been doing into 4 major categories. For that, you can see that we have conifer removal, fire rehab, or kind of seeding. We have spring improvement projects, as well as the application of herbicide to kind of try and start to combat that sea of cheatgrass. And what you'll notice here is that in the past 10 years, NDOW has pumped just about $2.5 million into Washoe County in terms of habitat projects. And, I'm going to turn this over here to Mark Freese because, not only does he know a whole lot more about the subject than I do, but he's been the one in charge of implementing these projects.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Nice work. You make it pretty easy for me to go over all that background, so I appreciate it. So first off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the constraints that we deal with. A large portion of Washoe County is managed by Bureau of Land Management, but we also work with Sheldon Wildlife Refuge. We have Pyramid Lake and various private landowners. But as a part of that BLM partnership, it's complicated in Washoe County. John's got one of the more difficult tasks. He works with 2 states between Nevada and California. The Applegate Field Office and Eagle Lake Field Offices are managed out of California. We've got the Winnemucca District and the Carson District. So there's a whole mess of partners and players that come into play here. So he's got a heavy lift when it comes to meeting people, building relationships, doing projects, slightly different processes between each district, each field office, each state. And I say that to say, like, all these projects we implement on public lands really requires NEPA, which is National Environmental Policy Act. There's a whole permitting clearance process we have to get through with BLM, Sheldon, to get projects implemented. So there's a bunch of diversity when it comes to our players up here in Washoe County. There's also numerous special designations. So we've got wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, areas of critical environmental concern, just you name it, we've got a lot of it. A lot of HMAs with wild horse and burros, and various permittees. So there's a bunch of constraints, not to mention the natural constraints we deal with low resistance and resilient plant communities that is in the majority of Washoe County, presenting some real challenges for what we can do in terms of implementing habitat projects. We also have that drying trend John mentioned. 13 of the past 20 years have been pretty dry, and it looks like it's going to continue. Go ahead, John. So just real quick background on kind of our approach. So we're, as an agency, very opportunistic. Where those opportunities arise, we try and jump on those. We also rely on our partnerships and permitting, not managing much land in Washoe County. Those partnerships are critical. Us as an agency is very nimble and flexible, more so than some of the federal agencies, if you could believe it. We were actually on the phone with Winnemucca District talking Poodle Fire Rehab earlier today, and they're getting their contracts in this week for work this fall. For us, we can have a contractor tomorrow, so long as they're available. So that's an advantage for us, and we try and leverage our partnership and our opportunities, and where things we could be more effective, we try and step in and help on project work. But we do have some limitations, and probably our greatest limitations personnel in terms of Western region coverage. We have, not even a full-time position dedicated to habitat restoration projects. Tori Cernock is an NDOW NRCS partner biologist, and she will be great, but she only has half her time on wearing an NDOW hat. And then I spend about a third of my time doing restoration work. We have some funding limitations, but we're scrappy. Many partners, help us, for example, in our wildfire rehab efforts. We've been spending statewide between $2 and $3 million a year, and that's usually about 25 to 30 different partners coming to the table, local NGOs. So those are greatly appreciated. In general, we prioritize our work where the wildlife values are high and where that intersects with the magnitude of habitat uplift we could get. That's really our triage approach, not being able to do everything everywhere, but focusing on where we're going to get the biggest bang for our bucks. Basically, we try and give communities, vegetation communities, a nudge in the right direction with some active management such as herbicide, seeding, fencing, and then let passive management take over. We really have a narrow window with some of these threats like wildfire to come in and treat quickly with the right seed mixes at the right time in the right place to try and shore up some of our losses when it comes to wildfires. We have numerous abilities to get seed acquired, both through BLM seed buy, MDEP seed buy, and then also through private, through industry growers. And then another item I just want to touch on, there's kind of a debate when it comes to seeding, you know, native versus non-native. We don't necessarily care so long as it's adapted to the community and provides habitat values. But we're always looking at hedging our bets and try to use the most effective material and stretch our dollar the furthest. Go ahead, John. Next slide, John. There you go. So here, I'm just going to introduce some of our projects that we've worked on over the past year and are currently working on, and just give kind of an intro into what these projects entail and what they look like. So you can see a list of the fire rehab projects we implemented over the past year in Washoe County, the spring and meadow enhancement projects, and then I'll talk just briefly on a juniper removal project. Go ahead. So the north of Baccarat fires burned in 021 in the Peterson Mountains. We partnered with BLM to seed about 2,000 acres in North Fire and about 2,700 acres in Baccarat Fire. We included sagebrush and bitterbrush, as well as a diversity of grass mix for BLM where they were short. We partnered, BLM contracted that work, and we just provided them seed, hauling the seed, helping them dump the seed. And then BLM came to us last fall and said, we've got about 16,000 sagebrush and bitterbrush plants to get in the ground, but we can't get them in. Can you help? And so we stepped up, we contracted it, got them all in the ground in December. And just looking at kind of the funding there, and now spent about 86,000, BLM about 290,000. And then we partnered with Woodland Village Homeowners Association to help pay for some of that cost as well. Go ahead, John. So starting in the upper left-hand corner, we've got sagebrush and bitterbrushes in boxes. This is just an example of what the planting project entails. Contractor crews hauling the boxes, sticking them in the ground, and with the end result of having some sagebrush on the ground. Sagebrush plantings are usually more successful than seeding, more reliable. So in those key core areas, we will sometimes contract out planting projects to help get that vegetation community a step in the right direction with a little greater assurance than just seeding. The bottom pictures going from left to right is just a BLM seed delivery truck. The middle photo, we generally just dump bags of seed into a mixer, mixes it up, it fills the hopper that the helicopter or airplane can pick up, and then it'll fly it on. Go ahead, John. So the next slide shows, is just an example, not from Washoe County, but from the Draw Fire in Clan Alpine Range. And so this is what we were attempting to do, burned hot in this PJ stand. So we wanted to give that vegetation community a nudge in the right direction. So we seeded a diverse seed mix of forbs, grasses, and sagebrush. And you can see the first photo on the left is the first year following that fire. We had really good establishment. And then you can see year 2 post-treatment on the right, where that vegetation community is heading the right direction. Generally, it's going to absorb, take up all the resources on site, and cheatgrass isn't going to be able to come into this site. Next. And this is an example of what we expect it to look like in about 10 years. This was a treatment BLM did just adjacent to that Draw Fire 10 years ago. You could see there's a bunch of perennial bunch grass, good sagebrush cover as well. The leader growth on the sagebrush is pretty impressive. And when Jason flies this area, he sees a lot of his mule deer in this burn. So we're just getting in there, trying to get that treatment completed, and the vegetation community headed in the right direction to provide quality values for mule deer, but also to ensure that that site is stable and functioning, so that if it does reburn or there's any other disturbances, it's going to continue providing mule deer habitat and other species habitat over the long term. Next. This is another picture of the draw fire on a south aspect. It's a hot site in terms of temperature. So we figured we weren't going to have great success on this south aspect, at least not in those areas where it didn't. The burn intensity was high, and you can see that from this photo. We had really good success around those tree crowns where it burned hot, but in the inner space, you've got quite a bit of cheatgrass where cheatgrass persisted through that fire and was the first thing to come up. The two photos on the right, the top one's year 1 post-fire, the bottom one's year 2, and you could really see cheatgrass fill those inner spaces quickly between year 1 and year 2. This site was not seeded, and I think that's an example of, you know, if you do nothing, what you're going to get. And obviously it's not a very good result. Go ahead. Just another example. This is one of the Virginia complex fires on the north side of the Virginia mountains. And an example of doing nothing sometimes gets you further behind. And so we've had a brush community that was providing valuable habitat to sage-grouse, mule deer, antelope, converted to a cheatgrass, mostly dominated stand that's going to continue providing low-quality habitat over the long term and more likely to burn given that continuous fuel source. Next. Here's an example from the Hot Springs Range. We seeded a combination of private and public lands with BLM. Our drill seeding, we had a really low precipitation year following the drill seeding, so it wasn't very effective. But what was effective in this case, and I'd like to point out, is the kochia that we see. This is snowstorm kochia on the left. You can see how big and tall it is compared to Bobby Jones in that picture. And at the time, the BLM personnel didn't want us to put it on public land, so we did it. So you can see a picture with kochia and without. Well, Jeremy Lutz did some pellet counts, and he found 10 big game pellets in the kochia seeding and 0 on the BLM piece. So that kind of highlights that importance. Mule deer will find it if we could put it out there. Go ahead. And this is the Bravo 17 fire, burned in 2017 on Fairview. We used a diverse seed mix, pretty high elevation site. But one of the things that came out, kochia was less than 5% of the seed mix. However, you look at it today and it dominates the site. And this is what I talked about, kind of hedging our bets. Kochia is really a reliable plant in really arid regions. It's easy to grow. It can withstand grazing quickly after it puts down roots. So we like to throw this in the seed mix where we're allowed to, but often we're told no, because it is a non-native species, and that's just one of the challenges we have to face. Next. Okay, moving on to another fire. S4 burned up on the border of Sheldon on BLM land. In this case, Craig Drake called and said, there's a big chunk of private we want to drill with BLM, but we have no way to pay for it. So Indows stepped up and bought about $15,000 worth of seed so that BLM could drill it and make a complete polygon in that part of the world. So I think that just speaks to the value of these partnerships, having good relationships with our federal partners and trying to fill the gaps where gaps exist. Go ahead, John. Okay, Poodle Fire burned last year in August 12th. BLM identified about 3,900 acres of chemical treatment in the burn area that was dominated by cheatgrass. We went out there, we looked at the site, we said, there's a whole lot more of this bench that probably needs to be treated. And so BLM permitted us. Indows sprayed about 7,755 acres with the Mazapic. That's that green polygon just to the east of 447. We got in there because BLM couldn't, given the late nature of the fire and their contracting deadlines. So we stepped up, filled that gap. We just had a meeting with BLM this morning, and BLM's planning on seeding that entire polygon this fall. And I'll show you some pictures of what the herbicide treatment looks like. BLM also treated or seeded about 8,000 acres of the WSA on the west side of 447. Go ahead, John. So here's an example of a herbicide treatment. This was actually on the Martin fire. On the left, you can see the area that was sprayed. On the right, that's the untreated. Go ahead to the next slide. And then if you're standing in that same spot and you pan left looking at the treatment, that's the left photo. And if you pan right of the untreated, that's an example of the untreated site. So this is incredibly effective at removing cheatgrass, which gives us the opportunity to seed. And it allows us to seed into an area relatively free of competition with cheatgrass and increases our odds of success. It's almost like taking the drought out of that just by removing the cheatgrass competition. It's adding water to the site, nutrients, resources that our seeding can take up effectively. Next. So here's an example of the Poodle spray project John, I, and Tori were out on just a few weeks ago. Picture on the left just shows it's a strip that was just barely missed. You can see how effective flying that chemical out of the airplane is. On the right, we've got active cheatgrass growth kind of at that purple stage. On the left, we have a dead cheatgrass stand. Picture on the right shows all that dead thatch, that cheatgrass and medusa head that's not growing, and it really releases some of the perennial vegetation that's on site. Next. Here's a picture on the left is from last year with that current year's cheatgrass growth, and the picture on the right is what it looks like right now. It's a dead zone. It doesn't necessarily look pretty, but you can imagine if we come in and seed this, how effective that seeding may be in the absence of cheatgrass competition. Next. Another example, Poodle, just higher up on the hill. Picture on the left is kind of a bald hillside where the herbicide was sprayed. Very effective herbicide treatment, but again, you can see there's not enough vegetation on site to take up those resources and suppress cheatgrass into the future. So seeding is definitely needed in that site. Picture on the right's a little different. This area was sprayed, but there is good enough residual vegetation where seeding may not be necessary. Those plants are kind of under a release, have additional water, additional resources. They may be able to fully occupy existing resources and help prevent cheatgrass from coming on site. Go ahead. Okay, another project from Washoe County, Virginia Mountains Green Strip. So we've partnered with BLM Carson City District for a number of years to try and improve and make a green strip along Winnemucca Ranch Road that connects to that Doyle Flanagan Road. The Virginia Mountains are a constant source of burning, reburning, not allowing some of those brush species John mentioned to come back. So we're trying to build a green strip through here to allow fire crews to get in there and effectively suppress fires before it spreads. We're also working with BLM on looking at some additional green strips, making better ones along the Petersons, along 395, where we get a lot of fire starts. But in this case, we sprayed about 3,700 acres of public and private land to build off of previous sprayed efforts that BLM did. And we're going to continue that. The red polygons are what we're planning on contracting for BLM this year to continue to build some of that green strip into the community so that fires won't continue to carry up into the Virginia mountains. Go ahead, John. Here's just a couple pictures of the Virginia Mountains green strip. Picture on the left shows some residual vegetation cover. that was released after we suppressed some of the cheatgrass. The picture on the right, you can see all that dead thatch, generally lacking enough desirable species on site to hold out cheatgrass into the future. So picture on the right, we're definitely going to be coming back to and reseeding. Okay, moving on to Buffalo Hills spring enhancements and just spring enhancements in general. So we partnered with BLM a number of years ago, came up with a number of projects. There's actually 15 in Nevada, and California's got another 15 projects to improve some of the spring resources on site. So we've got about 12,000 linear feet of pipe rail fence we've been installing, which equates to about 37 acres. NDOW slung all the material into the site. BLM is contracting the project, and we're both contributing funding to get that contracts implemented. Go ahead. So here's a list of those springs, the 15 springs on the Nevada side, which is left of that blue column. You can see many of them have been completed. We're trying to push it across the finish line and finish the remaining ones, hopefully this summer, and if not, into next year. And then you can see the California projects on the right. Go ahead, John. So here's an example of Porcupine Spring, one of the springs that we completed. Picture on the left is 2015. It was a drought year. You can see some of the damage, degradation, the hummocks on the picture in the right. But you can imagine this does not really store and release water long-term year-round. But if we had all the soils on site, that's just a bigger sponge to help retain some of that soil moisture and provide that moisture at critical times later into the year. Go ahead, John. So here's a side-by-side photo. Picture on the left was directly after we installed the fence. So it had experienced grazing for the year. The picture on the right is the same exact spot, just taken 8 months later after a full growing season. And you can see that transformation. We've got good cover, good forage on site, but probably more importantly, the hydrology will be able to start to heal itself, become a little bit bigger sponge and help store additional water longer into the season, being available for wildlife. And this is one of those projects that may be able to help us, counteract some of the drought conditions we're experiencing. Go ahead, John. There's also additional things you could do around springs, meadows. There's lots of rock structures, different designs for different applications. Beaver dam analogs are used. This is a rock rundown that was used on the California side to stabilize a head cut. A head cut's essentially an erosional feature that starts in a meadow, a spring system, and it works its way up the stream system, whereby lowering the water table, so you start to get brush encroachment into meadows. You have a lower water table, and you're losing some of that ability for that spring, that meadow system to retain that water longer into the season throughout the year. So they stabilize that with that rock rundown. You can see the picture on the left in 2018. The one on the right is taken in 2019. Successfully installed that, stabilized the meadow upslope to help retain some of that larger sponge effect. Go ahead, John. Divine Springs is one we implemented last summer. We contracted about 3,100 feet of pipe rail fence, about 12 acres total. Go ahead, John. In these next pictures, you can see some of the conditions in 2017. It's just a site that experiences repeated summer grazing, clear through the summer, and certainly it's had its share of impact, sheared banks, loss of vegetation, bare banks. It's not functioning as good as it should. Go ahead, John. So NDOW partnered with BLM. We paid for most of the fence and contracted, although BLM put a bunch of money into the NEPA clearance and permitting. And so you could just see a picture of the meadow with the fence, with and without the fence. I haven't been out there this year to take some repeat photos, but be happy to share those in the future. Go ahead, John. Dan, you might recognize this project. This is along Divine Springs, another site that experiences heavy use, repeated heavy use, and aspen aren't able to grow. Dan and Scott, I think, were the two who built this fucking rail fence. You could see pictures from 2013 on the left and on the right from 2020. They also planted aspen in that exposure, and you could see how much those aspen grew over the course of that 7-year period. You could see the site's healed. It's able to retain that moisture, providing good forage cover. When I went to take this picture, there's a doe bedded underneath that willow tree. And she felt comfortable enough with me, you know, about 20 yards away with that cover that she just laid there. It was kind of cool. Go ahead, John. Guzzlers, they're another way we can help with some of the water issues, drought conditions. In Nevada, we have an active Guzzler program. We manage over 1,700 guzzlers throughout the state. About 500 of those are big game guzzlers. The picture in the background's a picture from Cherry Mountain that was built a few years ago. You can see some of our new construction in Washoe County. We built about 8 units over the past 7 years. We were going to build another unit last year and ran into some COVID challenges there. But we do have active and available units to build in Washoe County. So that could be another option for us to address some of the water challenges we face. Next. Moving on to PJ removal projects. So we've been working with Applegate Field Office. Applegate's a really active group when it comes to Juniper removal projects. This Garden Lake one, I think they refer to as Stump Flat. It was identified for both mule deer and sage grouse, targeting some critical Juniper removal areas around some springs, some lecks. Just us working and partnering with BLM, having that good relationship, we were able to get BLM to permit this project. There's archaeologists out there right now doing ground clearance surveys, and they plan to contract this work in the next year or two. Next. Example of a PJ removal project about an Applegate. You can see a section that was untreated on the left on this rim, about Boulder Lake. The section that BLM treated on the right. And you can imagine that all those trees in that area take a lot of water, take a lot of nutrients at the expense of a lot of the understory species. So in this case, this treatment's going to release a lot more of the water nutrients to some of the shrubs, some of the grasses on site. Should have a lot more leader growth, a lot better nutrition for mule deer. But they still did a nice job and allowed some cover to remain on site. Next. Just another example of an Applegate Field Office Juniper removal project. Same picture, just picture on the left's untreated, picture on the right's treated. You wouldn't even know there was an aspen stand in spring amongst all that juniper. They went in, removed all that. That's going to help that aspen community as well as the spring put out a little more water, which will ultimately be good for the majority of wildlife. Go ahead. And those were just highlighting mainly some of the NDOW projects, but certainly BLM is very active with a lot of their projects. Applegate, they probably treated between 15 and 20,000 acres over the last 20 years and tens of thousands of acres of seeding following wildfires. Eagle Lake, we're working on with those spring enhancements and plan on continuing to. After these 15 springs are done, we're going to look at additional areas we can improve. They've also seeded tens of thousands. Carson District, just within the Washoe County portion, has cut about 6,800 acres of juniper. They've seeded about 1,700 acres and then treated about 4,000 acres with imazepyk, which is the chemical I showed us using to remove the cheatgrass. It's a pre-emergent herbicide. It's effective for about 15-month period, so that generally when you seed those projects, you're following it for 1 year and coming in the following year and seeding once that chemical is basically ran its life cycle. The Winnemucca districts treated tens of thousands of acres, wildfire, another. So we've got really good partnership, really good group of folks to work with, active at doing habitat project work. Next. So just thinking about this group and how to address the threats, I just wanted to outline some of the opportunities, I guess, from a habitat perspective. You know, I think in any district, any area, wildfire rehab's a critical tool, critical need. Hopefully I articulated well enough, you know, in some of these low resistant resilient sites, which most of what Washoe County is, the value of seeding and getting in there and putting seed down, getting that community started in the right direction. Otherwise it could be forever lost with no action. I think there's a number of places we could go with spring meadow type enhancement work, including Applegate, Eagle Lake, Carson, and Winnemucca District. Juniper removal, it's probably a bigger issue up in the Applegate field office part of the world. And they're really active. They've got a good program. We could help prioritize areas and they can help us out by getting some of that work done. Not as much of a need in the Winnemucca District piece or the Eagle Lake. Guzzler installation, we could certainly look at new areas, new opportunities across many of those districts as well. And then green strips to help prevent some of the fire from coming in. Eagle Lake's looking at doing more chemical treatment and doing some green strip work. So I think those are just a rough list of some of the project ideas that I think we could work with moving into the future. Next. So just, I don't want to end on a downer note, but certainly, you know, I think John has painted a picture, you know, with climate, weather, drought, some of the limited potential fire invasive species, juniper, limited water, improper grazing, humid. We've got a significant challenge ahead. We certainly can't sit on the sidelines. I feel like we have to take an active role if we want to have anything for the future and for our kids. You know, in the picture on the right, this was the draw fire burned untreated. A picture on the left just with the existing vegetation community, you know, and it bothers me when I see that picture, the picture on the right, to think, you know, if we don't do anything, a lot of our landscape could look at that. But so we're not short on opportunities for habitat improvement project work. Next, John. So just a quote I like is, "We cannot do nothing. Failure to act leads to consequences just as significant as acts of management." At this point, I'll turn it back over to John.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And so for members of the public, you can submit your public comment to ndowgame@ndow.org. But first, I think we're going to kind of jump in here and, you know, have a discussion about what some of the subcommittee thinks is going on with this mule deer herd and address any questions that you guys may have.
So John, do you have to unmute us or can we?
Nope, no, I can hear you. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay. You know, one of the things I was struck by is, first of all, your historic perspective of this. You know, really, John, that only goes back 20 years. I think it's pretty important to understand what's happened for the last 100 years, and in fact, that reference that is shown from George Brule and Sherm Swanson, Nevada's Changing Wildlife Habitat, is a superb book for everybody on this subcommittee, and in fact, all sportsmen really, to read as far as how we got here, what we did to the land what we did to the vegetation and the water resources to get us to this point. Now, 100 years ago, for example, we almost had no mule deer resources here. I interviewed for an article a gentleman who was in his 90s, and that was in the 1990s, who talked about deer herds now in, of course, he was talking about the 1990s being tremendous as compared to what they had been at the turn of the century, 1900 through 1920s. Would note that his family would take, and when I'm talking about his family, I'm talking about like 10 people, uncles and cousins and so forth, would take a buckboard up to Hunter Lake, and 10 guys would hunt for a week, and they thought they were successful if one of them harvested a deer. He couldn't, he was just, and he drew a tag in like 1994, and was just amazed at the number of deer behind Belli Ranch and in the north end of the Carson Range. It was kind of astounding. But then he also said that they would take their buckboard on a day trip to Stead, and they could fill the wagon bed with sage grouse at Stead. And so again, different times, different animals react differently. I really would suggest that as many of us as possible would read Gruel and Swanson's book. It is enlightening. But back to your John, back to your population trends, your fawn to doe. You comment that the fawn to doe ratio of being above 30 is stable or maintaining, or in the case, I think, of 021, possibly increasing. But at the same time, our populations are decreasing. So there's things going on there that we do not understand. Okay, what is happening? One of the things we have not discussed at all tonight is predation. And again, I want to give this group a little bit of historical perspective, being an old bastard, okay? Because I've been in the state about 56 years now. When I first came here, and I ran all over northern Washoe County, in fact, both in my business as a geologist and as well as a sportsman. It was a tremendous novelty if we ever saw a mountain lion track in the snow. In fact, it was bar conversation, and guys would run out to see for themselves. Old trappers like Tony DeBold and Gerlach, would go a decade without seeing a mountain lion track. Fast forward to today, when trapper Mitch Bailey, between Spanish Peak, just outside of Sparks, to Pond Peak, traps 11 mountain lions in 4 months. Okay, we have a tremendous eruption of mountain lion population in this state. A trapper sent me here, and I don't have it in front of me, I'd reference it, a wildlife publication in 1946 that showed the distribution of mountain lions across Nevada. In that article, they stated that the mountain lion population in Nevada was restricted to the northeast and eastern portions, that there were almost no mountain lions in the west and west central portion of the state. Fast forward that to today, where you can't go on a chucker hunt in the mountains practically and with a fresh snowfall that you don't cut a mountain lion track. There is significant dynamics going on here that we don't understand, okay, that we don't recognize or we won't accept. The same thing with wild horse and burros. I sat on BLM's National Wild Horse Advisory Board for a decade and got off in 2010. And it was one of the most frustrating endeavors I've ever had in my life, because the BLM horse specialists know the problem. They actually know the solutions, but their hands are tied by budgets, by lawsuits. Not only do the wild horses, and I was disappointed in the filling out the limiting factor ranking sheet, that the mention of wild horses is overgrazing by wild horses. Wild horses simply outcompete our native wildlife species. They guard water resources. Yes, they outcompete them for forage, but forage is just one aspect. I think all sorts of studies have shown that when big animals and smaller animals are thrown together, deer leave with a big population of cattle or elk. Deer are going to leave when we have a big population of wild horses. It is that density. The deer are pushed out in these areas where we have high populations of wild horses. And those wild horses are everywhere. They're to the highest elevation everywhere in Washoe County. We didn't discuss disease, and I think that may be an extremely poorly understood factor as well. Because there are parts of the state. Why are we having declining deer populations in the rubies of all of the highest, the luscious, the magnificent habitat, but yet we still see that slow, steady decrease? I think there's got to be factors going on here that we just don't understand. And guys, some of the biologists I have the highest respect for look you square in the eye and say, we just don't know. And that is I forget your terminology, your terrible problem or your unsolvable problem or something.
The wicked problem.
Wicked problem, and so forth. There is so much to digest here. My fear, I'm a habitat guy. Guys, I've built over 100 guzzlers in northwestern Nevada, and starting in 1986, if you can believe that, it was my first one. I'm a habitat guy, but our habitat improvements take us, we'll be lucky if we see results, I think, in a decade from these. I think our deer herds in Washoe County are, I think, in such tough shape that we also need to be looking at quick fixes. What would possibly give those deer a jump start? And quite frankly, mountain lion removal might be one. Wild horse removal is obviously one. And we say, we can't do anything about wild horses. I think the Wildlife Commission needs to recommend to the governor that the state of Nevada sue the federal government. And Dan, I hope that doesn't step on your toes, but that is the truth. I don't know how else. I just got an email from a horse specialist from BLM that said, could we enlist sportsmen to dart wild mares with PZP? Okay. When we've got 50,000 of them in the state in remote areas, that quite frankly, the use of contraceptives to lower a 50,000 animal population down to 12,800 or whatever, I think our AML is, I mean, is laughable. Something drastic and immediate needs to be done. I know suit against the federal government is something probably that a Democratic governor has no stomach for, or a Democratic attorney general. But something needs to be done. And I apologize, I'll get off my soapbox, okay?
No, I definitely, respect the heck out of your opinion, Larry. It sounds like you've been out here for quite a while, and you know the resource, and you definitely appreciate the resource. So I definitely appreciate all of those comments. And I hope that with this project 46, we can kind of start to get an estimate or some sort of abundance for both horse numbers and for lion numbers. But that's only the beginning of it. Once you have the estimate of those populations, then like you said, you still got to figure out what to do with them. And we just got word this morning that they're looking at doing a potential gather through BLM in the High Rock. So it's scheduled to take place late this year. And for that, they're going to be removing horses out of that High Rock HMA. So, it's not removing horses out of all the places that they need to be removed, but hopefully it's a start in the right direction.
Unfortunately, again, I've been here so long, guys. I'm 76 years old. Okay, I have seen multiple gathers in all of these horse management areas, and again, BLM's hands are so tied by Congress, by horse advocacy groups who send out such false propaganda that the wild horse is on the brink of extinction, and BLM and ranchers are trying to exterminate the wild horse, and on and on and on. It something major. I saw, again, historically, Wyoming got their wild horse populations reduced to appropriate management level simply because they sued the federal government. And so they got, and that descent decree may have expired, and I don't know if what in later years has happened in Wyoming. But in the years I was on the advisory board, Wyoming got taken care of first because there was a court order and there was a mandate to maintain those horses at appropriate management level. Guys, you realize that's like 12,000 something animals, not 50,000 something animals here in Nevada.
Yeah, and this is Dan, and yeah, Larry, I don't want to say I totally agree with everything you're saying, but I think you're right on point. Whether it's a lawsuit or whether it's some other sort of pressure, I mean, I know Mark and I have talked about it probably candidly out in the desert but yeah, at the local level, at the field office and district level, we every year will put in for funding to try to do a gather, and that's all appropriated by Congress and by our headquarters. And whether we whether we're 300% over or 1,000% over, who knows where that money goes, and unless there's pressure. And so I do think out of this committee, there could be some sort of plan put forward if we identify horses as one of those critical threats, which I feel they are, even speaking for BLM. Some sort of way of putting pressure on our headquarters to give the field offices the ability to manage. Because out of all of our programs that we have at these local levels, horses are completely out of our hands. And so that's why, working with NDOW and John and Mark, you guys gave great presentations on the projects and the partnerships and the things that NDOW has already done. And I'll tell you right now, I mean, that has been awesome and gangbusters since, and probably a little bit earlier than that. But the pitfalls that we run up against is a lot of times with the federal government and the state government is capacity. And so, also if we're going to look at doing habitat projects and identify some of those, like John talked about, what are some of our opportunities? I almost don't want to identify habitat projects because we all know that, those are the things that we're already doing, and we're already seem to have some momentum with the different districts. And there is funding out there, especially with sage grouse, that can tie into mule deer as well. But like Larry mentioned, predation hasn't been discussed, and horses was touched on a little bit. And I do have to agree with him as far as that immediate nudge and giving those, the deer populations that are out there, that more immediate or more short-term improvements might be something that I think would be a little bit more supportive and worthy of giving a try, because I think we do have a very good, diverse number of habitat projects, and I think we're focusing them in the right areas, but those are, again, very long-term. And especially with fire rehab, we're up against what, when we put seeds in the ground or seedlings in the ground, what kind of precip are we going to get? Are we going to get anything that really is going to allow that, that habitat to come back? And so, so I think, definitely looking at timeline and looking at what are some of our maybe more immediate things that we can do for mule deer, as well as what our long-term game is, because I really think that, and I'm maybe biased just because we've been doing a lot of work in our district, but I think keeping that momentum should be a priority of this working group, because I think already, Mark and, Chris, the previous biologist, as well as the field office staff and the BLM offices have already, bought off on the basically drank the Kool-Aid that we need to continue to start doing things, because that is our long game as far as doing the habitat improvement. And then, looking at those riparian projects, and again, I'll say that I'm biased on those because I started those with our district, and that was really the only thing we could do to somewhat manage horses, where horses were just completely taking over those riparian areas and those water sources. And so, giving us the ability to do some sort of management that reduces horses' impacts on the landscape. And again, Larry, it's not habitat wide, and as far as the impacts that horses do, but focusing on those riparian areas was a start. And so where we could look down the road might be a good a good way to look at how else we could alleviate horses without just gathering, because gathering is, again, unless we have some sort of pressure to our headquarters, to Congress, I just don't see it changing. And maybe it's a lawsuit, maybe it's some other pressure just from governors or a coalition or something like that. But we have to look at, what we can do right now and what Mark presented on, what we've been doing and keeping that momentum. But I do agree with Larry as far as looking at all of those facets, because I don't think we can put our thumbs on one single thing that's impacting the habitat or impacting herds. But I do think that we should, identify a top list kind of thing and what we want to really tackle. And some of those might be a combined effort too.
I was, gentlemen, Dan and Mark, and of course, Mark and I have built enough pipe rail fence together. I was incredibly impressed by the habitat programs that you have underway. And of course, with wildfire receding, there's never enough time, never enough money, never enough resource, never enough seed to really take care of everything we need to on those. But that being said, I'm very impressed with what you guys have accomplished and what you have underway. And if we can just keep that momentum up, and I presume that you're doing as much as your staff can process. Is that a true statement?
As far as BLM goes, I would say capacity is almost tapped out in most areas, but again, like I mentioned earlier, you have capacity where you get turnover. So, a good example is, our wildlife biologist out of the Applegate field office that covers the whole, 0, 1, 1 through 13 and 14, he's on a detail right now and he's probably not coming back. So we're going to have to, go ahead and fill behind him. So you have lapse in capacity there as far as, the person's not there and we're waiting to fill it. Just like John, just took this position and, we're getting kind of a late start with this committee. So you always have that issue. And, one reason I feel like, I'm really happy to be on this committee is because I'm pretty much in concrete where I'm at in this Northern California district that covers a lot of that part of Washoe County. And so I don't feel like I'm going anywhere. And, just being able to know exactly what the offices have available to use, I would say it varies year by year. But I would say we would have to really look at a lot more contracting avenues, which NDOW has helped out tremendously with, as well as bringing on some more site specific crews for if we have like spring developments that we want to do or something like that. Because our internal staff, we have a number of projects going on, and then, we'll have a 100,000 acre wildfire that basically derails a lot of our projects and shifts it to another facet of that. So I would say yes and no, and it varies by office as far as our capacity goes. And but I do think we have opportunities to do more. And we have filled in some positions in this Eagle Lake office as well as in Applegate that are with fairly ambitious individuals that at this point, it looks like they're going to stay around. And so those are definite opportunities, I think, for us in the federal government.
Mark, are you still there?
Yeah, Larry. Capacities are our issue. I would say, we're probably overextended.
Yeah,
frankly.
yeah, I would have thought.
And so I've been working to address that for a number of years, and it's slow, but I think we'll get there here in the near future.
Well, this is probably not the meeting to reach this conclusion, but as much habitat work as you guys have got underway, is this subcommittee even going to recommend to the state committee additional projects, or Or are we just gonna go rah, rah, you guys go for it? That's something, again, our group needs to think about. Arnie, Steve, what do you think?
Well, Member Pitts speaking, I am certainly excited we have such eloquent members and passionate members on this committee. It seems like that's neat to see. And I know a lot of us coming from the aspect that predators and horses are a big problem. Everybody says we can't change fire and we can't change drought, although it looks like we're doing a heck of a job trying to change some of these things, which is, Larry, I think it's awesome that we're doing these, and I think we should continue, especially some of this cheatgrass work.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I've never heard if there's anything we can ever do about cloud seeding again. Maybe that's above our pay grade, but trying to get more water into this area. I don't even know if that stuff's still talked about. But I like what Dan and Larry are saying, that we need, more of a five-pronged type of project where we're thinking about the horses, the predators, even if those are hard to deal with and hard to talk about, as well as continuing more and more of this habitat, fixing, which this is, I appreciate the department taking the time to educate us on all this. It's amazing what they're doing.
It is.
Yeah, this is Steve Robinson. I do want to, echo what everyone else is saying about the habitat. I think, and we've had presentations at the Washoe CAB meeting discussing what a great job that they're doing and showing all the projects we have going. One thing that frustrates me a little is the department mainly wants to talk about drought conditions, water, the climate. And that's one thing that we just really can't, we're not going to be able to do anything about with this committee. I hope we focus on the items that we can actually do something about. And with the diminished habitat and limited water resources, we should concentrate on those areas where we can reduce some predation, we can reduce horses. As Larry was saying, not just the horses competing on the water sources and reducing the habitat, but also just drinking up the water. The amount of water each horse can consume at each time, and the numbers of horses, these springs just cannot keep up with it in Northern Nevada. And so I think we really should concentrate a lot on the horses. I think the lawsuit, I've been discussing this for a while. The only reason we're in this situation with the horses is due to lawsuits, preventing the BLM from doing the job that they need to do, removing the horses. And since it is severely negatively affecting wildlife in Nevada, I think the department has a good standing on forcing their hand just to follow the Wild Horse and Burro Act. Nothing more, nothing less, just follow federal law and we'd be in really good shape. And then I know the department doesn't like to hear it, but we do need to really look at the predators, because that's something that we can immediately affect. I know, John, on your graphs, it was saying that, or you mentioned about the project in the granites that we were reducing predators, but it didn't have a negative or any positive effect. And I don't think it's actually true. If you look at the graphs that we had from that time, while the predator project was going on, the herd was increasing and increasing. And as soon as we stopped in 2012, it rapidly declined again. And so we should look at those studies, and it might be a good time to look at another study. And if we can reduce more lions in that area and see the population go up again, we know that will help. If it continues to decline with an aggressive lion project, then we know that may be a waste of time and abandon it. And not just lions, but predators in general, at certain times in certain areas in the state. So that's what I have.
Yeah, and just to kind of address that real quick, the wording was that there wasn't a significant difference in that deer population compared to the surrounding units. So, predator removal was done in 014. And if you look at, the surrounding units, those populations were rebounding and, having the same positive effects. And same with the bighorn sheep in the surrounding units. If you look at them across the borders of those units, it was just that, there was really good years of rain in there. And that kind of contributed to some pretty beneficial habitat for those populations is all I was saying. I wasn't trying to say there's no effect of removing predators at all. just that looking at it statistically across the borders there with the ones where you weren't removing it. And, you know, kind of to piggyback off of that, right now we're currently removing lions in 011 through 013. And, you know, looking at those numbers, they seem like, you know, they're not doing much better than the surrounding units. So I kind of agree with what Larry was saying there in the beginning, where, you know, it's not just one thing. And I don't think, you know, we're going to put just one proposal forward, but I think we got to kind of put, you know, multiple proposals forward and try and address as many of these issues as we can. And, you know, I certainly agree that we got to do, you know, something in terms of like short term as well as long term. So to get at what you were talking about, Steve, with horses, and you can't do anything about it not raining, you know, I agree wholeheartedly that we're not going to grow this deer herd until it, you know, we get some significant amount of precipitation. But what you can do is kind of go in and try and mitigate those effects by putting that fencing around those springs, so that not only do you have the water there keeping the horses out of it, but then also that vegetation in there is going to kind of grow back and be better for the deer. But yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying.
And John, I do agree. I think it'd be foolish to think that there's just one factor in any of this. There are so many reasons that our mule deer is declining throughout the state. Like Larry mentioned, why is the Northeast doing poorly when they're, you know, the habitat seems to be great up there? You know, we're doing really bad and our habitat doesn't look so great. So that's bad also. But, you know, overall, we need to address all the multifactorial components of this. But there's very few things that we can actually positively address. There's very few action items that we can actually do, was my point.
I'd like to say something. This is Joe Zweifel. I think everyone, it seems to be on the same page. There's many factors contributing to the mule deer decline. And I don't want to beat it in like everyone's kind of, you know, I agree, everyone's in agreement here, but the habitat projects are great. They're super long term, which we just need to continue to do. Everyone agrees. I think the short-term projects are huge. I don't know what's going on with 011 and 013 with predator control, what they're doing, how many they're taking out, or any of that stuff. But I would like to see, or I'd like to know a little bit more about the collar data with the deers. What are the fatality, like what's going on and all that. If you guys have an idea, yeah, we can see where they move around and see what we can do with their winter range, summer range. But what's their mortality? What's going on? Why is the decline the way it is? I think collar data, you know, like you said, doesn't lie. I like the fencing projects, the riparian areas. I think that's a short-term, quick help. Predator control as well, and then whatever we can do with horse and burros is huge. And then the project in 014, I thought the graph was significant, the population of what that did in there. Maybe not the surrounding units, but in there it seemed pretty significant. So, and it could have been as well with precipitation, I get that, but and I don't know how long it went on or any of that stuff. I would just like to see more data on all that, but.
Yeah. So here's kind of what I was talking about here with in the surrounding units. You know, you also had an increase in the bighorn sheep population in 012. And then, you know, kind of to the tune that we've all been singing, 3,000 feral horses were taken out of there. So that likely had a pretty substantial effect on it. And then in terms of just, you know, what I was referencing here, you got 014 where you had the predator removal. And then these are your contour intervals for your confidence in it. And so, yeah, but I mean, I hear what you guys are all saying, and I definitely am in agreement. I like the idea of doing the pipe rail fencing for kind of more short term, and then, you know, looking at some of the other things in terms of like stuff that you guys want to go out and look at for this field trip that we're going to take. Did you guys have any ideas on that?
Well, there's a bunch of sorry springs to go.
I was gonna add one more thing. So I think, and Joe reminded me of it with the collaring data. So with the High Rock gather planned for this fall. And then there's another gather that's planned for next year for the Twin Peaks gather, which is primarily 015. I think it'd be really good to look at the data or the collars you have out already, as well as that camera study you were talking about, and really be able to set like a baseline for when those horses are removed to be able to have some like to start that data collection there. And I know there's already probably a lot of data that you're collecting, but to basically show that drastic reduction in horses and see if there's any correlation with the deer herds, you know, over the, you know, short term, whether it be 5 years. You know, the sad thing is even after those gathers, they'll probably be back up to, you know, the existing AML in the next 5 to 10 years. So I do think it'd be a good item to track, is to look at those areas that we're going to be doing some gathers in this, the areas that are covered by this subcommittee, and see what we can do for monitoring to, you know, one, hopefully show, I mean, I don't want to try to predict science, but, you know, hopefully show that the reduction in horses is improving habitat and you know, inadvertently or advertently, you know, improving mule deer, or, you know, or not, you know, but it'd be good to like set us up while we know those gathers are going to happen this year and next, you know, to be able to set ourselves up for that monitoring data to be collected.
Yeah, and sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to, I completely kind of glossed over your question there about sources of mortality on the collared mule deer. So unfortunately, that's not something that I know the answer to, but I was hoping that Cody Schroeder was going to be on the call. He's our kind of deer specialist. But what I'll do is I'll get a hold of those data and kind of track down out of the collars that we've had deployed, how many, you know, survived the full 2 years that the collar was on them and it dropped off, and then how many, you know, what their sources of mortality were, and I'll kind of get that information and report back to the group on that. But yeah, sadly, I'm too new to know the answer to that question.
And John, in one of my other former lives, I was the field research assistant for a PhD student, Allison Andreessen, here at the University of Nevada, and I've inventoried many dozens of mountain lion kills where we had 25 lions GPS collared, and my duties were to inventory and catalog the kills, and again the results were just staggering, quite frankly. You know, I think the average adult lion took, if I remember right, 33 big game animals a year, and in a range like I live in the Paras here, where I mean, I've got lion tracks almost on my property many times a year that I see, and you know, you're new in the position and so forth like that, but when I see you give data that in area 022 the population is up slightly, the fawn ratio is up, you know, it paints, quite frankly, way overly rosy picture. Area 222 is in the tanks. It is a shadow of what it was 10 years ago, let alone 15 years ago. I can't help but question data when I see that. And we had lions collared here, and quite frankly, they were probably 90% horse killers. Okay. We had lions move from the Paras into the Virginia mountains that because the horse population was lower in the Virginia mountains, became deer, antelope, and bighorn sheep killers. It was intriguing to see those trends for those years that I did those studies. But again, I go back. I personally think there's a higher mountain lion population in Washoe County than any time in recorded history. And that's, again, you kind of have some of that. You got to be kind of an old timer to put that into perspective. And you know, your research program with mule deer, wild horses, and predators. I mean, okay, predators are impossible to count. You just don't do it. I think the best records to help estimate wildlife predator population are probably from wildlife services and trappers. And I know for a fact that trappers a few decades ago was an extreme rarity to ever catch a mountain lion in a trap. That's just 30 years ago, not 50 years ago. And now they're catching them left and right. It is an incredible population that we have going for us. Okay. And that's enough. I've talked about lions enough for one evening.
Member Pitts speaking, to answer your question about field trips, John, I think we should go on some of the chucker counting helicopters. Would be a nice one to go on.
They don't do those anymore.
I know. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know that I can swing that one.
No, but I don't think we can go out and do a field trip about predators, probably.
Yeah.
But maybe we could do some areas that are in need of some fencing and some springs that might be helped and help put together a project. I think that'd be a neat thing for us to see.
Yeah, that was more so what I was driving at. Not necessarily saying that we shouldn't, look at predators as one of our proposals, but in terms of going out here on the landscape and stuff that I can bring you guys out to and show you, maybe a bad example of what a spring looks like when it's, heavily impacted, but I'm assuming all of you guys know what that looks like. But maybe also show you some of like the successful fire rehab, or like you mentioned, some springs that have previously been fenced out, or even just springs that we want to target. But yeah, just trying to get a feel for that to try and look towards that next step.
I think it's fascinating because you go into some of these springs that have been fenced out where you can drive through them, and it's just amazing how lush it is inside there versus outside of it. It's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So John, you said we have the rest of the year to put together our list of projects and so forth back to the state committee. What is our schedule?
Yeah, so I'm looking to kind of take a field trip out here with you guys, as soon as possible. I know with having a big bunch like this, it's going to be kind of difficult for us to kind of, coordinate all our schedules, but I can do more doodle polls. But, sometime towards the end of July, or if that's too soon for you guys, we can, kind of look at it, August. But my schedule is fairly open after the first week of July. So, I'm open to hear when you guys want to go out. Then after we do that, we have to wait for the Oversight Committee to kind of approve the limiting factor forms and the mule deer need forms. And then I'll give you guys those and you kind of, fill those out, and we'll talk about which proposals we want to put forth. But, sometime in the fall, I'll have that, that proposal wrapped up and, submit those to the Oversight Committee.
I'd rather go sooner than later on anything, get the doodle polls going just to see if we've got to go through a bunch of checks and balances just to get things going. I think the sooner the better.
Okay.
Me as well.
This is Dan, and I agree with Joe. Like, I think the sooner the better. I would like to hear like your perspective or NDOW's perspective on, our unit groups. Like, is there, I know we're trying to, set out a plan for the entire area, but like, is there one unit or a portion of one unit that we feel is failing the most? And like, I think if we do have that information or that data, like maybe concentrating a field that in that portion or that unit would be most beneficial if we're going to maybe try to identify or prioritize some sort of project there. Because yeah, I mean, I'm a little jaded because working for the BLM and working with NDOW on some of these projects, I've seen a lot of them. So I do think they're spectacular to see, but I'd really, it'd be great to see a successful project, but I think we really should narrow down if NDOW has in mind already with the data you guys have, a unit or a portion of a unit that is like, this is really lacking and we need to improve the habitat here, or we need to do something here, then maybe we should start our efforts and focus in on there. Not to try to one spot, but I think that would at least be a good start. Looking at an area.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's a great idea. And, I guess I'll kind of leave that up to the subcommittee. You guys, you all know what's going on with each of these hunt units in terms of, as you just hinted at, Larry, you said that 022 is in the tanks and all that. So I think, everyone on the subcommittee likely has their own opinion about, which one of these units is the worst. So maybe, going through that, that limiting factor sheet will kind of help us say that, some of these are worse off than others, and maybe some only have one problem compared to, other units that have a whole slew of them.
Do you and Mark have a perspective on units? I understand coming back to the subcommittee, but like, I'm just curious because you guys hopefully know the data inside and out. And, Mark has dealt with a lot of the fire issues and stuff like that. I mean, I'm just curious on NDOW's perspective of like what units maybe are in the need of most help immediately or maybe long-term, if we can even think that.
Yeah, it seems like, not only do we, kind of hear the most complaints from people about 014, but, also looking at the data as Steve had kind of alluded to that, there was that pretty sharp decline there in that deer population. And then, also with the Sheldon, it seems like that population is really kind of dropped off. Fortunately, they've removed the horses out of there, but there's still some other habitat stuff that we may be able to work on. Or in terms of predator removal up in the Sheldon, that's with it being a fish and wildlife refuge, that one's pretty sticky in terms of working that out with them. But it's something that we can definitely address. But Mark, I'll let you kind of weigh in on the habitat side of it. But just looking at pure numbers, it seems like 014 is probably the one that's declined the most precipitously.
Probably that in the Sheldon. Yep.
Yeah, and Dan, I heavily relied on like Chris in the past and with John, right?
Mark, you're cutting out.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry. I haven't explored the data as much as I'd like, quite frankly. Just something I've always kind of leaned heavily on, like the game biologists, so Chris Hampson and John, right? Area 14 is perplexing, I think. I don't know, at least my discussions with Chris, like it made everybody scratch our heads. What's going on? It's an awesome mountain range, right? Awesome resource. It's got some decent elevation. I think in terms of potential, it's higher than some of the surrounding country. So I don't know what's going on there. And I don't know if we would be able to influence that, right? it could be, a disease or something that we just don't know about. So I don't have a good thought. I would definitely have to seek outside folks like Cody Schroeder if you want like a good NDOW thought process, right? Like John, Cooper, Cody, Mike, bunch of folks would have to get together and kind of start skull cramping. And we do that from time to time, right? Just on the habitat side, it's more of a reactive world, wildfire, grab your shit and go type approach. But yeah, it's a great question. I just don't know how to answer it.
One more thing I would like to see too is just a little bit more data if you guys are doing like body fat conditions going into winter, coming out of winter in the different units to see. And that's kind of goes, I'm sure that's habitat and everything else, but that would be nice to see as well, just to understand a little bit of maybe what's going on, if it's more habitat driven in certain units than others. And
for getting the body fat content, you're talking about like when we're capturing and putting collars on, then measuring it and kind of looking at that seasonally and seasonally as well as across units.
Yeah, I don't know. Are you guys doing that prior to going into winter, coming out of winter, to kind of see what's, or I don't know. I'm guessing just going off of other areas to why the deer are declining. If you guys are doing a little bit more to try to figure out if that would be a little bit more habitat driven, if they're getting enough nutrients and stuff going into winter, if they're not, how they're coming out of winter, and if it's more of the case in some units, that'd be more habitat driven than if they're going in great conditions, and they're still having a decline. Maybe it's not as habitat driven in there. Maybe it's something else. It's just something else to look at, I guess. But
yeah, no, I think that's a phenomenal thought process. So as a part of that project 46 that I talked about, we are actually getting 40 more collars to put out throughout Washoe County. And so that's actually something that previously wasn't done, but that's something that we may be able to do with these collars before we put them out. Unfortunately, it's not the NDOW biologist out there doing the capture, that's contracted out. But something that I know some of the other states have done is you can, provide the capture team with, it's almost like an ultrasound, but essentially what it's doing is it's measuring the thickness of the back fat. And that's kind of a good way of quantifying the health of that doe. So maybe what we can do is kind of straddle the seasons that we're putting those collars out and, look at them, back fat content going into winter, and then do some other captures, kind of on that tail end of winter and see what that back fat is like. Once again, I'm not entirely sure what the contracting would look like on that.
Okay. You can get sportsman help too, just by hunting, harvesting. I don't know if you can give out some kind of a, index on how they can check it out, pictures or whatever, but that'd be a huge help too. That could go for the October seasons prior to winter. And then I know in 021, it's a late season, it goes January, whatever, you can get some of theirs as well. And I know they're pretty poor, but it's a help rather if you guys aren't out there putting collars on and getting your hands on.
Yeah. And another thing too, is with us putting a bunch of collars out here, we, might be able to, as those deer die, we can kind of take femurs from them and you can crack that femur open and look at the marrow content. And so when a deer is in poor nutritional quality, the absolute last fat reserve that it has is in its bone marrow. So we can kind of try and do some sort of metric like that based off of the unit that it's in and maybe the time of year that it dies, looking at the health on that. But, it's with how remote Washoe is, it's super difficult to get out there in a timely fashion to where you can actually, get a femur that hasn't sat out in the elements for a week. So as that thing sits out there, some of that starts to evaporate out of there and it's going to seem like they're healthier because it's basically like a mixture of blood and marrow. And so you're looking at how much your marrow content is, but if that sits out there in the sun for a week, you know, a lot of that blood's going to kind of evaporate and it's going to seem like a lot healthier deer. But anyway, I'm just spitballing here. But yeah, there's definitely things that we can look at health-wise with some of those deer that we collar, as well as maybe even asking hunters for back fat measurements or just body condition or something.
This is Dan, and I'll make this quick. This is more of like a tech thing, but one is I take it, I know this meeting's recorded, and someone's obviously taking notes just because I know we're talking a lot of good ideas. But then the other thing I was thinking is, you know, this effort is happening, you know, statewide with all the other counties, and so I don't know if NDOW is set up, whether it's like a share drive or a SharePoint or something, to see what these other states are doing or these other counties are doing would be helpful. But then also, you know, other states, you know, neighboring Idaho, you know, neighboring Nevada have done these mule deer efforts. And so I don't know if sorry, hold on one second. So I don't know if it's something that's available, but, you know, being able to look at what some of these other states are doing and how they're prioritizing, you know, these mule deer efforts would be another thing that might be helpful to our group. So I don't know if, I mean, I can definitely do some research to see what's available publicly, but I don't know if you have counterparts in other states. And then obviously you have your other counterparts in the other counties, but to be able to not feel like we're trying to reinvent the wheel because Washoe County is super unique, but you know, it's one of those things that it would be good to know what other areas are doing too.
Yeah, I can try and see if I can track down some of that information.
Well, I appreciate this group's efforts. It seems like there's some hope that we can figure out some things and help the mule deer in our area. Seems like a good start to this.
Yeah, gotta try. And John, when I mentioned Area 22, it's because I live in the Paras and up in the mountains, and I see it and so forth. I don't think Area 22 is in any worse shape than any other unit in Washoe County. I think it's pretty universal all the way to the Oregon border and beyond, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, probably. Okay. I got you. I get you that it's just because you're in 022, so you're just seeing that firsthand. Yeah.
So when are we going to meet again?
I'll send out a doodle poll tonight for you guys if you'd like. For a doodle poll, I don't know if I can do like a month-long calendar or something like that, but just for you guys, I know everyone had said sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Are you thinking like second week of July or what's your version of early here? And then I can kind of coordinate that survey.
I think that works.
Okay.
Let's start there. And if we can't get anything going, then we'll just
keep pushing it.
Push another one.
Okay, cool. Great.
John, this is Steve Robinson. Just so you know, I'll be hunting until like the 12th. So I won't be able to do it until the weekend after that, whatever that is.
What are you hunting?
Things in Africa.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, what are you hunting in July?
I can't get a tag here, so I have to go beyond the boundaries.
Cool. Okay. So
good luck.
After the 12th, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I'll send out a doodle poll survey that starts on the 13th. And yeah, then we can try and get everyone on the same page. Also here, after we kind of wrap up this discussion with us, I do have one last agenda item. I gotta take public comment. So I'll have Cooper, who's been monitoring the game email, go through and allow for public comment. But I'm not trying to, cut you guys short by any means, but I didn't want the people tuning in for that to, think that we forgot about them.
Yeah, if there's any public comment, please raise your virtual hand. I do have one email that I will go ahead and read. This is from Rex Flowers. First, I feel your limiting factor sheet should be broken into hunt management units rather than areas. His second point is Unit 021 and 022 have no flights yet. We continue to create buck to 100 does and fawn ratios without these surveys. His third point, Unit 033 historically was a trophy unit and now is a standard area, which is an alternative unit. Also 033 not being able to show minimal survey to allow for independent model. Why do we continue to hunt this unit? And why hasn't the department put a greater effort into review of the area? One more point he had, in review of Unit 014, Project 18 ran 2004 through 2014. And I believe those were shown as highest population years. And with the stoppage of Project 18, populations seem to continually decline. Can this subcommittee go back and review those slides? Again, that's from Rex Flowers.
Okay.
I am still not seeing any virtual hands being raised.
Okay.
So we'll give it another minute to address any other further comments. Mel Belding has his hand up. I will allow him to talk.
Okay.
Mel, can you unmute yourself and go ahead and talk?
How you guys doing? You hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Mel.
I would just like to reiterate what some of the guys have said about the mountain lions, particularly Larry Johnson's comment. Started trapping with my brother-in-law in 1972 in northern Washoe County. Ran all the way through the Sheldon up to the Oregon border, through 015 down to the California border, trapped Humboldt County. I continue to do it today. And I'll just tell you firsthand, my brother-in-law ran minimum 250 traps, probably went 500 miles. He never hung a mountain lion, not one in northern Washoe County. The only place we ever hung a mountain lion was in the Selenites, the Limbos. They were there in the 70s, I know. They weren't in the granites. They weren't in the high rocks. They were not in 011, 033. So that side of the history, that's not anecdotal. I've been there. I know I lived it. Let's talk a little bit about this horse gathering you're going to have in the high rocks. And definitely predator control has to occur if we remove horses from anywhere. And, you know, you guys talk about the Sheldon, how it's horse free. Well, it's not 100% horse free, but it's damn near there. And the mule deer and the sheep have continued to decline. What is the gorilla in the room? It's predator. The Sheldon is devoid of horses. It's in very good shape. If you look at the upper elevations on Badger Mountain, you can't ask for a better place in the state unless we talk about 014 in the granite. I mean, these places are phenomenal. And right now, I mean, the flower growth is tremendous in Leadville Canyon this year. And I realize it's dry, but we have to control these predators. And I hope we do some quick things, but one real quick thing that we should do and we need to do is follow the success we had with the bighorn sheep transplant and augment deer. I mean, those deer, those does were killing in 06 would in area 6 would love to live in the granites. They'd love to live in the in the Sheldon. I think we need to look at augmentation too. Thanks, guys. Appreciate what you're doing.
Interesting.
Yeah. I appreciate the public comment, Mel. So yeah, in terms of augmenting that population, I am definitely, a little too new to the department to comment on that, but just off the cuff here, some potential issues with that is, when you move deer around the state, there's some disease potential issues. So, if you don't, you got to have some pretty good, thorough methods for testing those deer before you move them around is all I'll say. And I don't know if anyone else within the department wants to weigh in on that, but and Cooper or Mike.
Yeah, I would certainly take that into consideration for a comment that we would have Cody Schroeder respond to. There is a bill in LCB right now that may have some implications on moving mule deer. So I would ask that you forward that question to Cody Schroeder and he could respond to that for our next meeting.
It is intriguing that we move antelope, we move elk, we move bighorn sheep, we move bighorn sheep internationally, but there has always been a resistance of the department to move deer. Again, it is an interesting question.
Yeah. And then can you go back, Cooper, and go through the email there? I definitely don't remember all four parts of it.
Yeah, so Rex also asked units 021, 022 have no flights, yet we continue to create buck to doe and fawn to doe ratios without these surveys.
Okay.
His third point was 033 historically was a trophy unit and now is standard area, which is an alternative unit. 033 not being able to show a minimal survey to allow for independent model. Why do we continue to hunt this unit, and why hasn't the department put greater effort into review of the area? We can choose to address that now, or you can choose to kick that out to your group if they want to address that.
Kick it out to the subcommittee or to NDL?
So it's yeah, you can address it now if you would like, or you can ask if the committee would like to address any of those.
Okay. I mean, I'll tackle the 022, 021 thing. But so for the flights that have been done in the past, I can't, say what flights were flown in terms of, when the previous biologist was here. But, what I can do is give you my word that this fall, we're going to try and, fly the heck out of every single one of these units. And, me being brand new to this position, I'm going to spend, a decent amount of time in that helicopter because it's not only the best way to learn that resource area, but, I want to have a really good baseline, for where each of the populations are at with those units when I do the flight. So, I don't know, what's gone on in the past, but, moving forward here, I can assure you that we're going to try and get as many quality flights in as possible this upcoming fall. And then in terms of the, what's going on with the changing of the management and the Sheldon, that I was unaware that it had changed from a trophy management area to standard.
I'm seeing no further public comment.
Okey doke. You know, I know we'd kind of talked about it earlier, but I definitely appreciate the heck out of all the passion that you guys, you know, have for this resource area. It makes me realize how lucky I am to be here in Washoe. Just the fact that you guys came out here and, you know, gave up 3 hours of your night to sit here and talk mule deer. You know, I think that says a lot about how committed you guys are. So I definitely appreciate you listening and appreciate you contributing to it. And, you know, moving forward here, I'll try and get that doodle poll out to you guys probably tonight or early tomorrow morning. But, you know, thank you. It's great to see, you know, just how passionate you guys are.
And John, I gotta thank you and Mark and Dan, by the way, for your work on this. And let's go make a difference. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, John and Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, I guess we'll move to adjourn the meeting at 8:47 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.